The golden lights of the restaurant didn't feel like a celebration. They felt like a shroud. Stiffana Grain sat motionless, her fingers white-knuckled around a glass of juice that had grown warm and stagnant. She had dressed for a battle, to be seen, to be honored. But the man who claimed to love her had already surrendered her dignity to another. Across the polished floor, the sound of Billa Reaves' laughter cut through her like rough glass. He wasn't looking for her. He was leaning into a woman who demanded the room's attention, his confidence a weapon he only used when she wasn't the target. Something inside Stiffana didn't just break. It hardened into granite. She stood up. No tears, no spectacle, just the cold, hard weight of a woman who had finally found her exit. In the biting chill of the night air, a voice reached out through the darkness, gentle but carrying the weight of iron. It was Jang Seojun. He didn't offer a performance. He offered a truth that Billa never could. "You're strong," he told her. And in that moment the background character of Billa's life began to draw her own map. Billa Reaves, the man with the world at his feet, thinks he can ignore the woman who built his foundation. He flirts openly, a king in a kingdom of one, while Stiffana watches the man she loved dissolve into a stranger. He thinks she's a fixture, something he can leave on the shelf. He's wrong. The moment she walks out that door, she isn't just leaving a restaurant. She's burning the bridge to her own oppression. The golden warmth of the restaurant had become a suffocating weight, a gilded cage where the air was thick with the scent of expensive wine and the stench of a dying loyalty. Stiffana Grain watched the man she had anchored her soul to, Billa Reaves, lean across a distant table to whisper into the ear of a woman who wore her ambition like a neon sign. He didn't look back. He didn't even check the perimeter of his own conscience to see if the woman he brought there was still breathing. The laughter that erupted from Billa's throat was a sharp blade, cutting through the carefully curated version of the woman Stiffana had forced herself to be. For months, she had been a shadow in his machine, a silent partner to his arrogance, waiting for a crumb of the attention he threw so lavishly at strangers. She looked down at her untouched juice, the ice long since melted into a stagnant pool, and realized that the woman reflected in that glass was a stranger she no longer wished to know. Something inside her didn't just snap, it calcified. It was a quiet, tectonic shift, the kind of break that doesn't make a sound but changes the landscape forever. She didn't reach for a wine glass to shatter against the floor. She didn't scream for the room to witness her betrayal. That would be giving him a performance he didn't deserve. Instead, she reached for her bag with a hand that was suddenly, terrifyingly steady. She stood up, her spine a column of cold iron. Billa was still submerged in his own vanity, his back a wall of indifference. She didn't wait for the punchline of his joke or the inevitable moment he would turn around and expect her to be exactly where he left her. Stiffana stepped away from the table, each footfall a rhythmic rejection of the background character she had played for far too long. As she moved toward the exit, the golden lights of the restaurant seemed to dim, losing their power to deceive. She passed the waiters and the clinking crystal of other couples' promises, moving with a lethal sort of grace. She wasn't just walking out of a building, she was walking out of a decade of excuses. She was leaving the version of Stiffana that begged for scraps, the version that died the moment she realized she was the only one fighting a war for a man who had already surrendered his honor. The heavy glass doors swung open, and the night air rushed in to meet her, sharp, biting, and honest. She stepped onto the rain-slicked pavement, the silence of the street far more comforting than the noise she had left behind. Behind her lay the golden lie. Ahead of her lay the unknown, but for the first time in years, she breathed air that wasn't filtered through someone else's permission. The night was cold, but she was finally awake. The street outside was a different kind of war zone, one where the silence bit harder than the insults. Stiffana stood on the slick pavement, the neon hum of the city vibrating in her chest. A soldier who had just deserted a losing battle only to find herself alone in the no-man's land of her own life. The mist clung to her leather jacket like a cold sweat, and for a moment, the vastness of the world beyond Billa's shadow felt less like freedom and more like an abyss. "Are you okay?" The voice wasn't a demand, it was a steady hand extended in the dark. She turned, her defensive walls already rising, to find a man standing a few paces away. He was neatly dressed, a charcoal overcoat shielding him from the drizzle, holding a simple takeout bag that seemed forgotten in his grip. This was Jang Seojun. He didn't look at her with the voracious hunger she was used to, nor the dismissive pity she had come to expect from the world Billa built. His eyes held the weight of someone who had seen the fires and knew exactly what it took to walk through them. I saw what happened in there, he said, his voice low and carrying a rhythmic, sincere gravity. You shouldn't have to sit through that. Stiffana felt a tremor threaten the iron she had just forged in her spine. She forced a small, rough smile, the kind used to deflect a blow. I'm fine, she lied, the word tasting like ash. Seojun didn't move, but the air between them shifted. He shook his head, not in judgment but in a quiet, profound disagreement with her lie. No, he said, the word landing with the finality of a gavel. You're strong. That word, strong, usually felt like a burden when Billa said it, a justification for why he could hurt her more. But from Seojun, it sounded like an observation of a fact she had forgotten. It wasn't a compliment. It was a recognition of the scars she carried and the way she was still standing despite them. For the first time in a decade, Stiffana didn't feel like a convenient shadow or a silent partner. He felt like a human being. I'm Seojun, he added, a simple introduction that carried no performance and no hidden agenda. In the flickering amber of the streetlights, she looked at him and saw something terrifyingly rare. The truth. The night was still cold, the rain was still falling, and her life was still in ruins. But as she looked into his steady eyes, the wind didn't feel like it was trying to knock her down anymore. It felt like it was finally at her back. The heavy deadbolt slid home with a finality that echoed through the hollow silence of Stiffana's apartment. 4 years, this space had been a staging ground for Billa Reaves' moods, a place where she curated her own existence to fit into the narrow margins of his life. Now the air felt thin and stripped of the perfume of his expensive cologne and his even more expensive lies. She moved through the rooms like a shadow inspecting a ruin, realizing with a jarring clarity that there was nothing of her here. Every piece of furniture, every carefully placed ornament, was a monument to his taste and her total surrender. She sat on the edge of the bed, a vast king-sized expanse that felt like a desert. It was a cold bed, even with the central heating humming in the walls, because the warmth Billa offered had always been a transactional flame. She looked at her phone as it vibrated against the nightstand, the screen illuminating the dark with his name. Where are you? The first text demanded. Stiffana, answer me. I'm at the club, the second one read, followed by a string of missed calls. In the past, those vibrations would have triggered a frantic scramble, a desperate need to soothe his ego before it turned into a storm. But tonight she watched the light fade to black with a steady, unblinking gaze. She didn't feel the old, familiar panic. Instead, she felt the iron resolve she had forged on the sidewalk under Jong Seojun's steady watch. Billa wasn't worried about her safety. He was worried about his convenience. He was a man who couldn't stand a silence he didn't command. She reached out and turned the phone face down, silencing the shadow of her past. The apartment was empty and the bed was freezing, but as she pulled the covers up to her chin, Stiffana realized she was finally sleeping in a room where she didn't have to hold her breath. The war wasn't over, but the first battle, the one fought in the quiet dark of her own mind, had been won. The days that followed were a silent reconstruction, a slow gathering of the pieces Billa Reaves had scattered across the floor of Stiffana's life. In the vacuum of Billa's absence, Jong Seojun did not storm the gates. He simply existed on the perimeter, a steady beacon in a world that had always flickered with the unstable current of a rich man's whims. He began to show up in the small, quiet spaces where the dusks of her past usually screamed the loudest. There was no grand performance, no high-priced jewelry meant to buy a silence he didn't own. Instead, there was a cup of coffee left on her desk when the morning air was still gray and biting, the steam rising like a prayer, exactly the way she liked it, without her ever having to say a word. There were messages that vibrated against her palm, but they carried no weight and no hidden demands. They were simple observations of the day, a quiet, "I hope your morning is steady," or a shared photograph of a city sunset that required no reply, no explanation, and no apology. For a woman who had spent a decade translating Billa's silence into a list of her own failures, this new language was a revelation. With Billa, every gift was a leash. With Seojun, every gesture was a mirror. He saw the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way her eyes sought the horizon when the walls felt too close, and the way she carried her strength like a concealed weapon. He didn't try to claim her or categorize her. He simply stood present, a man who had seen the battle and respected the soldier. Slowly, the ice in Stiffana's chest began to thaw, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful clarity. She was starting to understand the difference between being managed and being seen. Billa had looked at her and seen a reflection of his own power. Seojun looked at her and saw a soul that had survived a fire. For the first time in years, Stiffana didn't feel like a convenient shadow waiting for the sun to move. She felt like the sun itself, finally breaking through a decade of heavy, suffocating clouds. The night air was still cool, but the warmth she felt now wasn't a transactional flame. It was the steady, unwavering heat of her own returning life. The silence Stiffana left behind was not a void. It was a cold, hard wall that Billa Reaves kept slamming his head against. For a man who measured his worth by the volume of his own voice and the speed of others' obedience, a week of unanswered calls was a sensory deprivation chamber he hadn't consented to enter. Initially, his arrogance was a suit of armor. He paced his penthouse, glass of amber liquid in hand, convinced that this was a tactical retreat, a woman's desperate attempt to play a game she wasn't equipped to win. He checked his phone with a smirk, waiting for the inevitable, "I'm sorry," text that would signal her surrender. But the smirk didn't last. By day 3, the armor began to rust. His messages shifted from commands to rough, annoyed inquiries. He was a wolf who had lost the scent of a prey he thought was tied to a post. He sat in the same gold-lit restaurants, surrounded by the same flashy distractions, but the air felt thin. He realized with a creeping visceral discomfort that he didn't know how to navigate a world where Stiffana wasn't the silent, steady anchor to his ego. By the end of the week, the annoyance had fermented into a raw, genuine confusion. It was a tectonic shift in his reality. He had spent a decade convinced that she was a fixture of the house, like the marble countertops or the custom-built bar. The realization that she had a will, that she could simply stop being there, felt like a betrayal of the natural law. He stared at her name in his contacts, a name that used to mean available, and finally felt the first cold draft of the night air she had been breathing since she walked out that door. He was a king who had woken up to find his kingdom was made of sand, and for the first time in his life, Billa Reaves didn't know the next move. The city was a rough silhouette of steel and glass, but beneath the neon hum, the riverfront offered a rare rhythmic silence that mirrored the steady beating of a heart finally finding its pace. Stiffana and Seojun walked the shoreline, the mist from the water acting as a shroud against the world Billa Reaves still thought he owned. For years, Stiffana's voice had been a decorative instrument, used only to harmonize with Billa's booming ego, but tonight the air was cool and the audience was sincere. She began to speak, the words coming out in a slow, hesitant stream at first, like a soldier recounting a long-buried battle. She told him about the blueprints she had hidden in the back of her closet, the designs for sustainable resorts and skylines that didn't just reach for the clouds but respected the earth. She spoke of the years she had traded her own brilliance for the convenience of being Billa's shadow, putting her dreams on a high shelf where the dust of his neglect had settled thick and heavy. Seojun didn't interrupt with the rehearsed charm of a man looking for an opening. He didn't offer the performative, Matthew Graham brand of flattery that always carried a hidden price tag. He simply walked beside her, his presence a quiet, immovable anchor. When she looked at him, she didn't see a reflection of her own usefulness. She saw a man who was actually listening, not just to the words but to the silence between them. "You see the structures in the marrow of the world," he said, his voice a low vibration that felt like a foundation being poured. There was no performance in his tone, no calculated arrogance. It was just the truth, delivered with the weight of a man who knew that a woman's vision was a force of nature, not a hobby to be managed. For Stiffana, the act of telling her story to a man who didn't try to edit it was the first real step in a long visceral healing. She felt the phantom weight of Billa's expectations slipping from her shoulders, replaced by the terrifying and beautiful realization that her dreams weren't dead. They were just waiting for a commander who didn't fear their power. The night was still cold and the path ahead was still unwritten, but as they walked, the horizon didn't look like a boundary anymore. It looked like a target. The intersection of the city's elite was a glass and steel cathedral where the air was heavy with the scent of old money and new betrayals. Stiffana walked beside Seojun, her stride no longer the hesitant shuffle of a shadow, but the measured march of a woman who had reclaimed her own territory. Then the atmosphere curdled. Billa Reaves stepped out of the amber glow of a private lounge, his designer suit a suit of armor that had begun to feel like a straitjacket. Billa's eyes didn't just see them, they sought to incinerate the space between them. He moved with the practiced, voracious grace of a man who believed every room was his kingdom and every person in it was an extra in his movie. He looked at Seojun, really looked, and saw a threat he couldn't categorize with a price tag. So this is the upgrade? Billa's voice was a sharp blade, dripping with the casual cruelty of the ultra-rich. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a gold-plated clip of bills as if he could by the silence of the man standing in his way. I don't know what kind of game you're playing with, my woman, but I've got cars that cost more than your life. Name your price and walk away before this gets expensive for you. The room went silent, the socialites holding their breath as the rich man rank was pulled like a desperate trigger. But Seojun didn't quail. He didn't even look at the money. He stood his ground, his presence a mountain of calm iron that made Billa's frantic posturing look like a child throwing a tantrum in a palace. You measure a man by what he can buy, Seojun said, his voice a low, steady vibration that carried more power than Billa's entire bank account. I measure a man by what he can't lose. And you've already lost everything that mattered. Seojun didn't raise his voice, yet the words landed like a heavy artillery strike. He stepped closer, not in a threat, but in a display of absolute, unshakable dignity that Billa's money couldn't replicate. In that moment, surrounded by the trappings of wealth, Billa Reaves looked smaller than he ever had, a hollow king clutching paper in a world that had moved on without him. Stiffana didn't say a word, she didn't have to. She simply turned her back on the noise, walking away with a man who knew that a warrior's worth isn't found in a wallet, but in the truth of his gaze. The neon pulse of the city outside the window felt like a distant, fading heartbeat as Stiffana Grain stood in the center of her apartment, the silence no longer a weight but a clarity. For a decade she had lived in the shadow of Billa Reaves, convinced that his wealth was a fortress and his arrogance was the armor of a king. But as the adrenaline of the confrontation with Seojun began to cool, the scales fell from her eyes with the visceral force of a physical blow. She looked at the photos of them together, at the expensive gifts that littered the shelves, and for the first time she didn't see love, she saw a collection of transaction receipts. Billa's power was a facade, a hollow structure built on the compliance of people he could buy and the silence of the woman he thought he owned. He was a man who screamed to be heard because he was terrified that, in the quiet, he was nothing. Stiffana realized with a rough, heart-stopping certainty that she had never been in love with the man who ignored her at dinner or the man who used his bank account as a weapon. She had been in love with a shadow, the idea of being chosen, the desperate hope that if she stayed long enough and worked hard enough he would finally see her. She had mistaken his possession for protection and his demands for devotion. As she watched the city lights flicker, the image of Jong Seojun standing his ground against Billa's gold-plated clip of bills burned in her mind. Seojun didn't need a skyscraper to look a man in the eye. His power was rooted in the marrow, not the wallet. The realization was a tectonic shift that leveled the ruins of her old life. She wasn't losing a great love. She was waking up from a long, expensive nightmare. The bed was still cold and the night was still long, but as she turned away from the vanity of her past, Stiffana Grain felt the first true warmth of a woman who finally knew the difference between a gilded cage and the open sky. The silence in the penthouse was no longer a luxury. It was a rhythmic, agonizing pulse that reminded Billa Reaves of exactly what he had lost. He sat in a chair that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, staring at a phone that refused to vibrate with the one name that used to be his constant. For a decade, Stiffana Grain had been the air he breathed without noticing, the convenient woman who anchored his chaos and absorbed his arrogance like a sponge. Now that the anchor was gone, Billa felt himself drifting into a high-altitude delirium where his money had no gravity. He looked across the room at the flashy woman he had used to humiliate Stiffana at the restaurant. Alexis was a vision of designer labels and practiced smiles, the kind of beauty that demanded a stage. But as the night wore on, the performance began to fray at the edges. Every word out of her mouth was a transaction. Every "I love you" felt like a down payment on a new piece of jewelry. She didn't see the man behind the bank account. She saw a walking ATM with a high-limit credit card. When he spoke of his confusion or the hollow ache in his chest, she countered with a request for a shopping trip to the exclusive boutiques downtown. Billa realized, with a visceral jolt of nausea, that he had traded a woman of substance for a woman of plastic. Stiffana had known the man who struggled. Alexis only knew the man who spent. The realization was a tectonic shift that leveled his ego. He was surrounded by gold and glass, yet he had never felt more impoverished. He watched Alexis check her reflection in a mirror, her eyes devoid of the quiet devotion that used to be his daily bread, and finally understood that in his quest for the flashy, he had thrown away the only thing that was real. The spiral had begun, and as the night closed in, Billa Reaves found himself a king in a palace built of sand, reaching for a merchant who had finally learned how to walk through walls. The rain had tapered off into a fine silver mist that clung to the windows of the small studio, a space that felt more like a sanctuary than an office. Stiffana stood by the drafting table, her fingers tracing the sharp, ambitious lines of the resort blueprints she had once hidden like a sin. For a decade, these designs were her shadows. Tonight, under the steady amber glow of the lamps, they looked like a manifesto. Seojun moved into the light, his presence carrying the weight of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He didn't offer the rehearsed flattery of a man looking for a trophy. He offered the gaze of a commander who had found a veteran. "I didn't just find you on that sidewalk by chance, Stiffana," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to ground the very air in the room. "I've been watching you from across the industry, watching a brilliant architect vanish into the shadow of a man who didn't deserve to hold your coat." The admission wasn't a confession of a stalker, but the recognition of a peer. He spoke of the projects she had secretly saved for Billa, the turnover rates she had salvaged, and the silent strength she had used to endure a decade of being ignored. "You weren't a victim, you were a soldier out of ammunition," he continued, stepping closer but respecting the perimeter of her newfound space. He reached into his overcoat and placed a heavy linen-bound folder on the table. A contract for the Harris Group's most ambitious resort development. It didn't have Billa's name on it, it had hers. "I'm not offering you a favor or a handout," Seojun said, his eyes meeting hers with no performance and no hidden agenda. "I'm offering a partnership. I have the resources, but you have the vision that the world has been starving for. I want you to lead this, not as an assistant, but as the architect of your own empire." For Stiffana, the quiet hope that had been flickering in her chest finally caught fire. She looked at the contract and then at the man who saw the warrior beneath the scars. It was the first time she had been offered a seat at the table without having to beg for the scraps. The night outside was still dark, but as she picked up the pen, the silence of the room felt like a beginning, not an end. She wasn't just signing a deal, she was reclaiming her soul. The rain had returned, a relentless rhythmic drumming against the glass that sounded like the steady march of an approaching army. Inside the quiet sanctuary of her new life, Stiffana was finally breathing air that didn't taste of desperation, until the heavy thud at her door broke the peace. She opened it to find a shadow of a man standing in the hallway, Billa Reaves, looking disheveled and stripped of the polished arrogance that had once been his only skin. He stood there with a bouquet of exotic, expensive flowers that looked garish and out of place in the honest dimness of her foyer. His designer suit was dampened by the storm, but it was his face that had truly withered. The extreme confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, visceral fear. "I made a mistake, Stiffana," he said, his voice trembling with a weakness she had never heard in a decade of his commands. "That woman, she meant nothing. It was always you. It was always supposed to be us." For the first time, Stiffana didn't feel the familiar urge to reach out and steady him. She looked at the flowers, a high-priced apology for a low-value betrayal, and saw them for exactly what they were, a bribe for a soul he could no longer afford. Billa's pride wasn't just wounded, it was shattered, and he was down on his knees in the doorway of a woman he had spent years trying to make small. "Please," he choked out, the word landing like a lead weight between them. "I'll change. I'll give you everything. I'll back your projects, I'll put your name on the building. Just come back." He reached for her hand, but she stepped back into the shadows of her apartment, her spine a column of cold, unyielding iron. Behind her, the quiet, steady presence of Seojun moved into the light. He didn't say a word, didn't have to. His very existence was a testament to the man Billa could never be. A man who saw her strength without needing to break it first. Billa looked at them, and in that moment the king of the city realized he was just a beggar at the gates of a kingdom he had already burned to the ground. The night air was biting and the flowers were already beginning to wilt. But Stiffana Grain had finally stopped waiting for a storm to pass. She had become the storm. The corridor was a narrow, dimly lit arena where the air had grown thin and heavy with the scent of rain and dying desperation. Stiffana Grain stood in the threshold of her new life, her gaze fixed on the man who had once been the sun around which her entire world revolved. For a decade, Billa Reaves had used his charm like a blunt instrument, a golden mask that hid the predacious hollowness of his soul. But as the light from her apartment spilled over his trembling frame, the mask finally cracked and fell away into the shadows. She didn't see the king of the city anymore. She didn't see the billionaire who moved markets with a whisper or the lover who once promised her the moon. She saw a man who was terrified, not of losing her heart but of losing his mirror. Billa wasn't crying for the love they had shared. He was weeping for the security of a woman who had spent 10 years absorbing his blows and validating his vanity. His shattered pride was a visceral, ugly thing, a coward's realization that his silent partner had finally found her voice. The flowers he held were a pathetic shield against the truth. Stiffana looked at the way his hands shook and the old, familiar urge to fix him, to make the world right for him at her own expense, didn't even stir in her chest. That version of Stiffana had died on the rain-slicked pavement outside the restaurant. The woman standing there now was forged of iron and memory. A soldier who had survived the siege and had no intention of letting the enemy back through the gates. Behind her, the silence was an anchor. She didn't need to turn around to feel Jong Seojun's presence. His quiet hope was a physical heat at her back, a steady, unyielding force that didn't demand a thing from her. Seojun didn't need to shout or pull rank to be the most powerful man in the room. His strength was a silent declaration of war against everything Billa represented. Stiffana took a breath of air that was finally, gloriously her own. She looked at Billa's fear and realized it was the only honest thing he had ever given her. The night was cold, but for the first time she wasn't the one shivering. The man she had once worshipped was just a shadow haunting a hallway, and the woman he thought he owned was already gone. The hallway was a narrow, suffocating trench, the air heavy with the scent of expensive roses and the cheap desperation of a man who had realized too late that his throne was built on sand. Billa Reaves remained on his knees, his designer suit damp and wrinkled, his hands trembling as he held out the bouquet like a white flag of surrender. But Stiffana Grain was no longer a soldier in his army. She stood over him, her silhouette framed by the steady warm light of the sanctuary she had built with Seojun, her spine a column of unyielding iron. "I waited for you," she said, her voice a low, lethal vibration that cut through his whimpering like a bayonet. Each word was a rhythmic strike, delivered with the visceral clarity of a woman who had survived the siege. "I sat at your table, I walked in your shadow, and I begged for your attention without saying a single word. I was the air you breathed, Billa, and you treated me like a dusk." Billa's eyes searched hers, looking for the old, soft compliance, but he found only the cold reflection of his own betrayal. The flowers in his hand began to wilt as the silence stretched between them, a heavy, final barrier that no amount of money could bridge. "You saw me breaking," she continued, her voice growing steadier, fueled by the quiet hope of the man standing firmly at her back. "You saw me standing in the wreckage of my own dreams, and you still turned your head to choose someone else. You didn't make a mistake, Billa. You made a choice. And tonight I'm making mine." The bouquet hit the floor with a dull thud, the petals scattering like blood on the linoleum. Stiffana didn't wince. She didn't offer a hand to help him up or a final look of pity. She simply turned her back on the kneeling king, her movement fluid and decisive. As she stepped across the threshold, leaving him in the dim, cold hallway of his own making, the night air didn't feel like a threat anymore. Behind her, the door clicked shut, a final metallic period at the end of a 10-year sentence. She had walked out of the war, and for the first time the victory was entirely hers. The heavy, metallic click of the deadbolt was the final shot fired in a decade-long war. Inside the sanctuary of the apartment, the air was no longer filtered through Billa Reaves' suffocating arrogance. It was clean, sharp, and finally her own. Stiffana Grain stood in the center of the room, the shadow of the woman who waited, having finally been laid to rest in the cold hallway outside. She didn't look back at the door or the man shivering on his knees behind it. Instead, she looked at the man who had stood as her silent sentry through the storm. Jong Seojun remained where he had been, present, unmoving, a steady anchor in a world that had always been adrift. There was no triumphant smirk on his face, no performative claim to her victory. He simply met her gaze with a quiet, unwavering hope that didn't demand a single thing in return. Stiffana felt the last of the iron in her spine settle into a foundation of pure granite. She stepped forward, her movement fluid and certain, and reached for his hand. As their fingers interlaced, the contact wasn't a rescue. It was a pact between two survivors who had seen the fire and refused to be consumed by it. Seo Jun's grip was warm, a visceral contrast to the transactional ice Billa had offered for 10 years. Together, they turned toward the window where the city lights flickered like a million new possibilities. They walked out of the apartment, leaving the wilted roses and the shattered pride of a hollow king on the floor. As they stepped back into the night, the air didn't bite anymore. It felt like a soft, golden promise. The shadows of the alleyways no longer held the dusks of her past, only the path to a future she would build with her own hands. Stiffana Grain wasn't just walking away with a man who saw her. She was walking toward the woman she was always meant to be. She had finally stopped searching for a home in someone else's shadow. In the quiet, steady rhythm of her own heartbeat, she realized the greatest victory of all. She hadn't just chosen a new life, she had finally chosen herself. The night didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like a beginning. There is a fundamental difference between a partner who uses you as an accessory to their own ego and a partner who recognizes and validates your individual strength and talents.